She wore a crown and the colors of a new nation, but behind the pageantry was a private life threaded with sorrow. How did Maria Leopoldina, Habsburg archduchess turned Empress of Brazil, die at just 29? And why do questions about her final days still haunt historians? This is the story of a public triumph and a hidden tragedy, of a woman whose political courage helped shape a country while her own strength was quietly eroded by betrayal, illness, and the limits of early 19th-century medicine. Born in Vienna in 1797 into the vast Habsburg household, Leopoldina was raised to be useful to dynastic diplomacy. Her education was unusually broad for a princess. Languages, natural history, and political affairs were part of her formation. From an early age, she understood that her life would be a bargaining chip in the great chessboard of European power, but she also learned to wield the tools offered to her. At 20, she left the ordered courts of Central Europe for a world she had been taught to imagine only in maps and dispatches. Her marriage to Dom Pedro, arranged in the atmosphere of the Congress of Vienna, was political by design. The union meant to bind Portugal and Austria in a web of alliances, yet the crossing itself became a crucible. The transatlantic voyage lasted some 84 days across unpredictable seas. When Leopoldina stepped onto the docks of Rio de Janeiro, she entered a climate of heat and politics she could not have rehearsed in Vienna. A royal court, local elites, enslaved peoples, and a Portuguese administration strained by the demands of empire. She arrived as a consort, but she would not remain decorative for long. Soon, her intelligence and sensibility to Brazilian affairs became evident. Fluent in several languages and conversant with Enlightenment ideas, she read the situation with acuity. On several occasions, she assumed regency duties when Dom Pedro was absent. It was during one such interval, a decisive moment in 1822, that Leopoldina used her political influence to press for Brazilian autonomy. Contemporary correspondence and later biographies note her active role in advising ministers and urging the Prince Regent to embrace independence. Historians such as Paolo Rizzuti emphasize that her political interventions were not ceremonial. They shaped the timing and tone of events that led to the Declaration of Independence. In short, Leopoldina was instrumental in the birth of an empire, even as she remained, in many ways, an outsider within its highest circles. If this history intrigues you, and you want deeper dives into her letters or the forensic studies about her death, like and comment below. Tell us which document you'd like us to examine next. Public life, however, increasingly collided with private rupture. The marriage that began with political promise soured under pressures few courtly manuals had foreseen. Dom Pedro's temperament and impulses grew strained in the confined theater of Rio's court. A pattern of infidelity emerged, most conspicuously his relationship with Domitila de Castro, later the Marquesa de Santos, a liaison that quickly became public and politically consequential. The imperial household's shifting loyalties and the king's open favoritism created an atmosphere that humiliated Leopoldina and isolated her within her own palace. The deepest trace of this private suffering survives in her correspondence with her sister, Maria Luisa. These letters, archived in European collections and repeatedly cited by biographers, reveal a woman who loved her children and felt the crushing limits placed upon her dignity. She complained of coldness and neglect. She detailed the court's slights and the indignities of seeing her husband's affection transferred to another woman who walked openly through the salons. Scholars who have read these letters point not to melodrama, but to a steady erosion of morale. She appears determined in duty, yet increasingly bowed by shame and loneliness. Those intimacies make the image of the Stoic Empress incomplete. They expose the human cost of rulership for a woman whose authority was circumscribed by gender and court protocol. Leopoldina's physical health mirrored this decline. From the moment she left Vienna, physicians and contemporaries noted her frail constitution and difficulty adapting to the tropical climate. Modern scholars cautiously suggest thyroid issues among other chronic conditions as plausible explanations for episodes of weakness, but such retrospective diagnoses must be presented as hypotheses rather than settled fact. What is clear from the sources is that medical understanding at the time was limited, and the treatments available were sometimes invasive by today's standards. Physicians of the era commonly employed bloodletting, topical applications, and other procedures intended to rebalance bodily humors. Records indicate Leopoldina underwent treatments that were typical for elite patients of her social milieu. Procedures that, in the absence of antisepsis and effective infection control, carried their own risks. In 1826, she became pregnant again. Pregnancy in the early 19th century carried dangers even for women of rank, and complications could escalate quickly. Contemporary reports and private letters signal that Leopoldina suffered a miscarriage late in the year. The miscarriage appears to have been followed by an infection, what sources then described as a severe systemic illness, and a rapid deterioration that medical interventions could not halt. In her final days, she wrote to her sister, conveying both maternal concern for her children and a profound weariness with her circumstances. Those closing communications are poignant evidence of a life governed by duty to others, even as she faced personal collapse. On December 11, 1826, Maria Leopoldina died at 29. The immediate aftermath produced a tangled mixture of official statements, rumors, and grief. Dom Pedro's behavior and his relations with his court were scrutinized by contemporaries and later chroniclers. Some newspapers and eyewitness accounts at the time speculated on the role of court neglect or on medical malpractice. Others circulated more sensational allegations, claims that ranged from deliberate mistreatment to accidental violence. Over the following decades, historians have had to sift through these conflicting strands. A later exhumation and forensic examination of Leopoldina's remains added another dimension to the debate. Forensic reports indicated the absence of bone fractures, a finding that challenges versions of the story that rely on violent physical injury as a proximate cause of death. It is important to stress what such forensic results can and cannot do. The absence of fractures does not eliminate all possible mechanisms of harm, nor does it speak directly to the emotional and social forces that may have shaped her decline. Likewise, a diagnosis of infection following miscarriage remains consistent with the medical narrative offered by many contemporaries. Scholars therefore treat claims of intentional physical harm as contested, and unless supported by direct documentary proof, as speculative. In short, the forensic evidence narrows some possibilities but does not complete the story. How then should we read the forbidden fate described in the title? The phrase is not a claim of conspiracy, but a way to illuminate the concealed contours of Leopoldina's life, the mismatch between her public role, a celebrated figure of independence, and the private history recorded in brittle, intimate letters. Her tragedy is not only the physical vulnerability that led to her early death. It is the silencing that often follows female agency, the way a woman can be celebrated for achievements in the public sphere, while simultaneously deprived of power and dignity in the closest quarters of her life. Her case also reveals broader truths about the era: inadequate medical practices, the precariousness of women's health, and the way courtly favoritism could inflict moral wounds as real as physical ones. Interpretations vary. Some historians emphasize her political legacy and argue that the nation's debt to Leopoldina's statesmanship should outweigh the pathos of her private suffering. Others, reading the letters and the clinical records together, foreground the gendered injustice she endured, a capable ruler whose personal needs were dismissed by the very structures she served. Both readings are compatible. They reveal a complex figure who cannot be reduced to either saintly martyr or tragic victim. She was, unmistakably, a stateswoman of consequence, whose personal life complicates the heroic narrative. The memory of Maria Leopoldina in Brazilian history remains ambivalent. Statues, portraits, and commemorations fix her image in collective memory as an icon of independence. Yet the letters that survive, those delicate threads of ink preserved across oceans, force us to confront what the ceremonial images often conceal: a woman navigating grief, betrayal, and medical peril without the full support her status might have implied. Her story asks uncomfortable questions about power and care in a world that valorized male prerogative while restricting female agency. In the end, the forbidden fate is less a secret murder than a withheld understanding of how a brilliant woman's life could be publicly celebrated and privately eroded. Leopoldina's death at 29 was the outcome of medical limitations, pregnancy complications, and an intimate environment that increasingly isolated her. It was also the result of historical silences, decisions by contemporaries and later historians about which documents to emphasize and which to set aside. The reconciliation of her political achievements with her private suffering invites us to read both the proclamations of independence and the small, sorrowful letters together. Her legacy endures because it resists a single interpretation. She remains simultaneously an architect of nationhood and a cautionary figure about the costs exacted by unequal power. To remember Maria Leopoldina is to acknowledge that the making of history often involves hidden lives, that victory on the public stage can coexist with grave personal loss, and that archival fragments, a folded letter, a physician's report, a funeral dispatch, can reshape our understanding of a life once thought settled. If this portrait moved you, subscribe for more deep historical biographies and check the description for sources and suggested reading, including editions of Leopoldina's surviving letters, biographies by leading scholars, and forensic reports referenced in recent studies. Her story is a reminder that history is always a conversation between what is celebrated and what is quietly mourned, and that listening to both changes how we remember the past.